All right, let's talk about heavy metal testing for heavy metal toxicity. When I first realized heavy metals were leaching into my bloodstream, I went straight to my doctors and asked for heavy metal testing. Now, these are the roadblocks that I came across that you need to be aware of. First of all, if your insurance is paying for the lab test, ask what the lab can actually test for. What metals can they actually test for? Because I found out that the lab that my doctor was using would only test for one of the metals that I was worried about. In fact, the entire lab only tested for one type of metal, and I think it was lead at that time. So the lab that your doctor is using may not be robust enough to check many different types of metals, and that's something you need to be made aware of. Secondly, doctors don't understand that medical devices can actually leach heavy metals into your bloodstream, and they're not proactive about testing. At the same time, doctors also don't understand heavy metal toxicity and the problems that we're having with it. And again, testing is not adequate. So when I first realized I had a heavy metal toxicity problem, the first thing I wanted to do was test to see if that indeed was the problem, because I needed to make a really big decision and have a major surgery. Another roadblock in this situation is that doctors don't fully understand how to test for the heavy metals. So let's go over the different ways that we can test. One way is to do blood work to see if the heavy metals are circulating in your blood. However, heavy metals are not constantly circulating through our blood. When our body realizes that we have heavy metals, they bind them and tuck them away and deposit them throughout our body. So you could take a blood test and it come back that you have no heavy metals, even though you have heavy metal toxicity. They're not always circulating through your blood. So when I first asked for the blood test, that's how it was described to me. And they said that it's almost worthless to do the blood test because there's a very small percentage that you would even see the heavy metals circulating through the bloodstream. You can certainly catch some of the cases that way, but the majority you cannot. The next on the list was collecting your urine and taking a urine analysis at the lab. So you go in and they collect your urine right on the spot, and then they give you something to go home with, and you collect urine for the next 24 to 48 hours. Now, the problem with this method is if you're not on any type of chelator, you probably are not peeing out heavy metals, which is why we become so toxic with them. So when I did this particular test, I was not on a chelator at the time. I did the blood test, I did the urine collection test, and all of them came back negative for heavy metals, even though I was heavily burdened with heavy metals. So there is a technique when you're doing the 24-hour urine collection that you would take a chelator like EDTA or some of the others, and then wait 12 hours and start collecting your urine and then have that tested. And at that point, we can see the heavy metals being eliminated with the help of chelation. Some doctors are calling this whole body burden testing for heavy metals. However, there are also discrepancies on if this is the proper method or not, and how accurate is this. Another problem that we have is all of the chelators chelate different types of metals. So whereas EDTA is really good with lead, it's not really good with mercury. So you could have a problem with mercury and not know it because you only tested using EDTA. So testing for heavy metal toxicity is extremely difficult, and we're just not up to date with what needs to happen to get it tested. And in fact, I don't even think we know of a proper way to have it tested. So heavy metal testing for toxicity is really not that good. And in my particular case, I tested negative, but I still had to make a decision on a major surgery to help my health. I couldn't really look at the data, which goes against everything that I believe in. And I had to make a decision based on my gut feelings about the situation. There are so many places that we need to improve with heavy metal toxicity. For instance, the labs and what they're testing for, the doctors not really having the ability to know how to test for heavy metal toxicity. At the time, I even went a step further and started searching for a doctor that understood heavy metals. However, there were none in my area. And when I asked my doctors about it, they were all really confused. They didn't know about a doctor that would specialize in heavy metals toxicity. It's really not looked at within the medical community currently. So the advice that was given to me at the time was to treat with chelators to see if my health would then improve. There are ways to test, for instance, taking bone samples, taking muscle samples, and then analyzing that to see if there are heavy metals. But there's none of us that are willing to do bone samples and muscle samples to see if we have the heavy metals. That is a rough procedure. The advice at the time was just to treat it as if I did have heavy metal toxicity to see if my health would or could improve. Now, that was the right decision for me because my health did improve. And I was able to look at other pieces of data in the situation. For instance, I knew the medical device that I had been documented as leaching heavy metals into the bloodstream. I happened to catch a Netflix documentary called The Bleeding Edge that was produced a few years ago, and it talked about a doctor that was an orthopedic surgeon that had a hip replacement, and he suffered from heavy metal toxicity. However, he had to figure it out for himself after he had what I think was a psychotic break. He now tests all of his patients that he does procedures on with medical implants to make sure they don't have heavy metals leaching throughout the system. So if I had to give advice on the situation, be careful with the testing. There really isn't any end all be all great test to tell us what is circulating through our body in regards to heavy metals. The more I look into heavy metal toxicity and the toll that it has taken on my life, the more I realize this is a really large subject and one that I need to speak on a lot more. So to quickly wrap all of this up, a lab test may show that you don't have heavy metal toxicity when you really do. Until our testing improves, or our methods of testing, or our understanding of heavy metal toxicity, we are going to have to use other pieces of information to make major decisions. So if you're out there and you're just like me, be careful of the lab testing, ask a lot of questions, and just know that this is a really complicated subject and one that still needs to evolve before we can simply say a lab test tells us everything we need to know with heavy metal toxicity.